So we are happy to have with us today Dr. Nick Woolf. He has worked full-time since 1998 as an ATLAS.ti trainer, educator, and consultant. He delivered, he delivered the keynote address at the first ATLAS.ti Users Conference in Berlin in 2013. Nick has served as principal data analyst or research consultant for numerous qualitative research and evaluation studies in diverse areas of the human sciences, and is a visiting academic fellow at Henley Business School at the University of Reading. His PhD from the University of Iowa in instructional design, and he is currently at work on a textbook named How to Use ATLAS.ti Effectively. So, thank you, Nick, for being here with us today. I am really very excited to listen to your presentation, so I will give the microphone to you right now. The microphone, Nick, is yours.
Thank you, Naringa. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be sharing with you one of my recent projects. Let me begin by giving an overview of the whole 30-minute presentation so you know what's coming. First of all, I'm going to give an overview of this study and its methodology, and let you know the focus of my presentation, because I can't tell you everything about the study. That would take me 3 or 4 hours. So I'll give a brief overview, and then I'm going to go through what I call 5-level QDA, qualitative data analysis, which is the basis of how I conduct my projects and also the basis of my textbook. Then I will begin describing 4 phases of this particular project, which resulted in a quantitative and a qualitative paper. Phase 1, and then phase 2, and then phase 3, and then phase 4. So there'll be 4 phases in all. The exact progress of a qualitative study is a little less neat and tidy than that, but in retrospect, it's possible to identify these 4 fairly clear phases, and then there are some references at the back of the presentation, and then some information about the textbook I'm preparing. So those are the slides you would get if you downloaded the slides. So now I'll begin with the overview of this study. This was a study conducted by Drexel University in Philadelphia regarding 44 low-income, food-insecure, that's in the US what we call hungry people, food insecure mothers of young children from minority populations who live in urban Philadelphia. And they participated in a photo voice study whereby they collected, they had small cameras and they shot pictures all over the city to represent aspects of their lives. And then they came in for interview, and the interviewers went through photo by photo, and they had wide-ranging discussions about their lives, because this is part of an advocacy project for food insecure young mothers, and this study was to try and get some more insight into their lives. So there wasn't a specific research question other than to understand more about their lives. My focus in this presentation will not be to tell you everything about the study, but to, in this brief time, just tell you these 4 major phases, so you can see how I took advantage of this very wide-ranging data to focus it down and produce different kinds of study. The way I conduct these studies is, over the last 15 years, I've been teaching people to use Atlas and trying to figure out why some people use it more powerfully than others. And I've developed this notion of 5 levels of the process. And in a nutshell, the main thing is to distinguish the analytic strategies you use, which is what you plan to do, from the analytic tactics, which is how you plan to do it, which in our case is using Atlas. And they're very independent and actually have very contradictory kind of characteristics. Analytic strategies are typically very iterative and emergent in our field, whereas the tactics of using software is rather cut and dried and specific. And people go wrong in not using Atlas powerfully by failing to see this great difference between the strategies of what you're doing, the nature of those, and the nature of the tactics you use. And so I have laid out this process of teaching and both using it, whereby we start with the research question methodology in level 1. We use that to develop a plan and a set of very specific analytic tasks. So far, nothing to do with Atlas. Then we take an analytic task and translate its units into the features or affordances of the software. And then we can undertake an Atlas task, and then we can translate that back in terms of the units of our data analysis. Without going into any more detail, I just want to let you know that, because as I describe each phase, I distinguish between the analytic strategies, what I plan to do, and the tactics of how I did it in Atlas, and they're contrasting. So the first phase was topical coding. You can see right at the top there, the name of each phase is going to be highlighted. This study had a large amount of data. There are 80 or 90 interviews, including 3 or 4 focus groups, very, very wide-ranging, with 44 women. And we really, in a sense, had no idea what was going on with this data. They were not very coherent speakers, and it was all over the place, but very deep information about their experiences of their lives. So when we read and reread this, our strategy was to do an initial conceptualization, and we realized we had to do a top-down approach, looking at the big picture of it before we could start any very specific grounded analysis of the details in order to get a big picture of the landscape. And we ended up realizing there were 9 very distinct topics and also 3 alternative ways in which they spoke other than their own first-person impressions. So then we decided, we came about this through these tactics. Reading and rereading and initial conceptualizing meant we did initial open coding to generate codes. And while I was doing that, I wrote outline case descriptions of each person to try and understand what was happening so that I could identify these big picture areas. And then I came down to these just 9 big codes, which I'm just going to show you in a moment. I prepared what I'm going to call a network guide in order to keep coding with it, and ended up with an HU which had these 9 basic codes well defined with their boundaries. If I now just switch over to Atlas and show you this project, the phase 1 of the project. So here are the here is the list of documents. As you can see, there are I guess 93 in all, and the way I've named the documents, for example, that first one is 01080709. So this is participant number 1, and the interview was done on the 8th of August, 8th of July in 2009, and they've been done over a period of time. On the left, you see the document families, because I made a family or a group for each participant's documents. So participant number 3 has 4 interviews, participant number 5 only has 1, participant 8 has 4. So I can use that accumulation of the documents a bit later. As I started reading and trying to figure out what was happening, I decided, which I don't typically do, which was to work in Word to create an outline or a case description of each person as they were describing. So I created codes, which I'm not showing you here on an earlier HU, and I started making notes in a Word outline and gradually developed some topics of interest: welfare, children's health, faith, and so on, as part of the process of trying to come to an idea of what the main topics were. So this isn't exactly a methodology, it is just a way of figuring out what the landscape was. And eventually I ended up with these 9 topic areas: abuse, violence, and safety, health, healthcare, housing, physical environment, self-image, relation with others, rock bottom experiences, resources they had, and so on. And that became the coding scheme. And they were mostly talking about their own experiences, but they also talked about their future aspirations, their personal theories of life, and their prescriptions about how things ought to be. So I considered those 3 different modes of describing their lives, different kinds of data. So we were interested in the first kind primarily, their own personal experience, but I also coded separately. And I'm in the habit of always putting a symbol in front of different groups of codes. So the 9 main codes had this pound sign, so they clustered together. And then the 3 different ones have this percentage sign, so they cluster together. And you'll see here I've also got a code for each participant. And you'll see why I need that in a little while in this highly structured initial coding. As I was writing those case outlines and as I started developing these codes, I was using the code comments down below here to start accumulating the definitions of these broad areas. And once I'd finished that, I made a network, an ATLAS network, which is displaying these codes and their comments, so I get like a map or a guide of this initial coding of my 9 main areas, housing, welfare, and so on, with their descriptions, and the 3 other modes. And I would put this in Atlas's roll-up mode. So as I was reading, I could say, okay, this is that, and then I can just pop down the network and I can easily see the whole picture. Now this is just a visual thing, and you can easily print this out and just have this by the side of the page, but I like to have it showing and being able to roll it up and down all the time so I can have a complete map of what I'm doing. It's rather more efficient than just going through code by code here on the right. So I ended up coding the whole 90 interviews to each of these big picture ideas. And when we got to the focus groups at the end, in addition to that, I would code every quotation with not only the topic area, but also the number of the participants, so I knew who was talking, because we had decided we were going to make the person, the individual person, the initial main unit. So in the focus groups, all the quotations are coded to their participants, and in some of them, you'll see that this one, there's 2 participants, number 6 and number 3 speaking. So this allows me to later extract information by person, which we're going to get onto now. So that was phase 1, where we coded the entire thing by these big topics. In phase 2, we created a new focused HU. We set the first one aside and we created a new one because we wanted to focus on one of the 9 topics, which was violence, and accumulate all the data for each person by each topic and increase the narrative coherence of the data, because it's so hard to read through large amounts of their conversation which are very incoherent. So the tactics for that was to code each person's interview as with their number, so that the entire PD became a single quotation coded to their number, and the focus group quotations were already coded to their number, so I could extract all the data for each participant. Then I could open it in Word and edit it down to be a little bit more coherent, and then create a new HU with 1 per PD for each participant. And that required some auto coding to recode by the topic. So I've got a reorganized HU, and I just want to focus on this for a little bit, this phase 2, because this is I don't often do this, but it's very, 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 very helpful. So what I did then was I see that, okay, the focus groups, every quotation is coded to the person it is, and then I would go to each document. Here's document number 1, and I would select all the text with Control A, and I would drag in code number 1, because this is code number 1, and the entire document has become a single quotation coded to the number 1. Now, when I extract all the quotations coded to relations with others in society, I can use the query tool to extract all the quotations coded to relations with others, that's one of the 9 topics, that co-occur or are overlapping with quotations coded to the code 1. And that would pull all the quotations in this PD, because the entire PD is coded to the code 1, as well as all the ones in the focus groups that are also coded to 1. So where you have a combination of individual a PD for a whole person, and also you've got a focus group, If you code the individual quotations in the focus group to the codes for that person and the entire interviews of the full PDs to that person, that allows you in the query tool to extract all the quotations for each person. So for example, I could do person number 1 now. I'm just going to leave it at their very first interview only, so there's not too much data to look at. So their first interview is coded to 1, and whatever this person talked about in the focus groups, their quotations are coded to 1. I can then go to the query tool, and I can say, get me all quotations for, say, violence. And then I punch in code 1, which is all the quotations coded to them, and then co-occur, and I end up with these 8 quotations, 8 of the, let's see, of the, how many is it? Excuse me, 357 quotations coded to violence in all, and 8 of them are also coded to participant number 1. And now I can extract this as a Word file. This is participant number 1's information about violence, and you can see that it's a little bit incoherent, and I can go through here and I can edit it down. I don't need this thing, oh really, for my purposes. So I can edit the text and make it a little more easy to read and remove things that are clearly irrelevant and so on, and end up with a more coherent narrative of what this person said about that one topic. And then I've got 44 of these, 1 for each person for all the topics, and then I can reintroduce that as PDs in a brand new HU, and that's my number 2 HU, the one you're looking at now. Here we don't have the 90 original documents, we have 44 new documents, 1 for each person, which is basically the output of the first one. So if I look at number 1, this is a document that consists of all the extracted quotations. This is really a quotation output from the first HU, but with the text cleaned up and made much more readable. And each person has their own. Now it's not coded, it's just a fresh document, but Atlas's quotation output includes the codes of the quotation. So now I could use the autocoder, which is what I did. I won't do it, but ask the autocoder to look for that string of text, and every time it was found, to turn it up until the next one into a quotation coded to that code. So I was able to automatically recode, just 9 autocode operations, recode all the paragraphs, and now this is my working HU. And I'm ready to go with the analysis. This is in a way the preliminary step. Now we come to phase 3, which is really the start of the analysis, which is the grounded analysis of just the violence data, 1 of the 9. And we conducted the analytic strategies here. We now started with normal grounded theory approach procedures. We did open coding of the violence data, and through the normal grounded theory types of processes, we identified its dimensions and the range points, and recognized that the working unit of analysis would not be each individual person, but a second unit of analysis, which is an individual case of violence that these women were talking about. Because as we read and analyzed it, we recognized that each woman had several violent episodes in their lives, and this is what the principal investigator was most interested in. And some women had one major one, maybe they were raped by their father or their uncle or something, and some people had 3 or 4 or 5 major violent episodes they wanted to talk about. So we decided to make each case of violence the unit that we would analyze on, and this became the key to the study. And now we had to turn that into the tactics. So we had to represent this unit, the case of violence, with something in Atlas. And we decided to make it a named quotation to which we would attach everything else associated with that case of violence. That meant all the other pieces of text in which they talked about that case of violence, and we also coded the central quotation to the dimensional range points. So our database really became a set of, it was about 250 cases of violence coded to these dimensional points, and that became our, what we would output. So let me go back and show you what this looks like. First of all, let me just tell you what the dimensional range points were. We decided that there were three main dimensions: the intensity of violence, and here are the codes that represent this. They range from level 0, I hope you can read that, which was violence casually recalled. They saw somebody shot in the street and they just walked by, it didn't make much of an impact. The next level, level 1, is fears, 1 and 2, fears of violence. And then levels 3, 4, and 5 are actual experiences of violence, short-lived, that didn't have much impact on them, longer lasting, which they eventually threw off the psychological effects of, and life-changing, which they've never thrown off. So we coded every instance of violence to one of those levels. And then there were two other dimensions. One was called the locus, which is how close the violence was to them. Did they perpetrate it themselves? Was it to their children? Was it to themselves? Was it close others or distant others? And then the life stage, when it occurred to them in the past, in their childhood, now, and so on. So if I scroll down and let's see somebody who's got some, I'll show you what one of these cases of violence looks like. I'm just looking down to find one. So here's one. So here is a quotation, and it's got a quotation comment which summarizes the case. In this case, it was a fear of surrounding neighborhoods. She lets children play on the porch, but people from other neighborhoods, blah, 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 whatever it is about. And what I did was, here's the list of quotations. Whenever there was one of these central quotations which became one of the cases, I changed the name of the case or the quotation to be the name of the case of violence. Normally we don't think too much about changing the names of quotations, but here the name of the quotation became the central way of identifying this case of violence. And so it wasn't a code, it was a particular quotation. And when we export these, then each one is headed up by this in capital letters, the name of the item of violence. And it's coded to background fears, the locus, and the life stage. Those are the three-dimensional points, and also the perpetrator and some other codes. And because only these central codes that represent these 220 cases of violence are coded to these dimensional points, those are the only ones that are coded. All the others are hyperlinked to it. So I'll try and find another one that's maybe got some hyperlinked quotations. I'll just find you a better example here. So here's one. Boyfriends physically abuse her. That's the name of the case, and it's also been made into the name of the quotation. It's coded to intensity 4, longer lasting. The locus means the closeness, it's to themselves, and the life stage, it's happening right now. And there are two other quotations that have been linked to it because later on in her interviews or other interviews, she's referring back to this one case. So I don't code all these individual pieces. I'm centralizing everything on identifying the central description of a case of violence and linking everything else to it, so that when this prints out, is extracted, I'll just extract this one. So here's the extraction of this one case. It's quotation number 21.4. The name of the quotation has been made the name of the event. And then here are the hyperlinked quotations that give extra text about it. Here's the basic text, and then here's the summary. And so I can print out all these 220 of these and have all the information on each case. Then, after this had been done and everything was coded, all of the cases of violence have been identified, Then I went to the final phase, which was to analyze all these. So I had 5 intensities of violence, that's one dimension. I had 5 locuses of violence, I called it, that's a second dimension, and 3 life stages. So 5 by 5 by 3 gives 75 types of violence. For each intensity and each life stage and each locus, I could identify 75 possible types of violence. So the next stage was um, to work on these 75 types of violence and to then distribute them by participant and see which participants had which kinds of violence. And we could further quantitatively analyze that based on their food insecurity status. And the quantitative article was one that correlated the fact that the women with the worst hunger or the worst food security did tend to have the highest degree of violence in their lives. And so that's what the article about. For the qualitative article, we extracted all the data for each of the types of violence and analyzed them interpretively to write an interpretive piece about this conceptual framework for understanding violence in their lives. Very, very different analyses, but they're all based on this unit, which is the case of violence categorized in these 75 types. So how do I represent those in ATLAS? Well, for each type, I can make a supercode. So for example, all the quotations coded to fear of violence, and the locus is myself, and the life stage was in my childhood. Those are 3 codes. All quotations coded to this, the first code and the second code and the third code. I could make a supercode, which is a formula of all those, and that would pull up all the examples of that type of violence. And then I can create frequency tables based on what each person, how many of those cases of violence in those different categories each person had for analysis quantitatively. And then I can also make co-occurrence tables about when each type of violence goes along with a kind of perpetrator. We have a list of about 10 perpetrators, friends, dangerous dogs, and this and that. And then we can also export the full text of all the quotations for each of these supercodes, each of the types of violence. So coming back to the HU, I can show you, here are the supercodes. So for example, just at random, this one is called 3-self-perpetuated-past. So that is all the quotations at level 3 intensity that were self-perpetuated by the woman herself and that happened in the past. So if I double click on that supercode, I find there are 5 cases of violence. And they're named right here because the quotation has been named in that way. Reflect on past violence is one, tried to kill self is a second one, known as a tough fighter is the third one, and suicide attempt is another one. So let's just go to one of these. So here is this case of violence. Here's the central quotation. It's coded, we know it's coded to 3 self-perpetuated and happening in the past, those 3 codes. We know that because this was one of the ones pulled up by the supercode, 3 self-perpetuated past. And it's got a hyperlinked quotation, where she talked about this later. And it's also got a comment on the quotation. So we can pull up those examples of self-perpetuated short-lived violence that happened in the past and read them all together and compare this person's compared to the other person's. Now we've got it all ready to go. We've got our supercodes. It turned out of the 75 possibilities, 5 by 5 by 3, only 45 actually had data in them. So there were 45 populated types of violence, and it's the ones listed down here. And I see my time is up, but rather than demonstrate it, I'll just mention that the next step is to produce a table of coding frequencies for each person by the 45 supercodes. So I would make a family of these 45 supercodes. I can do this in one fell swoop. I make a family of these 45 supercodes. Each one is over here, and I'll say these are the 45 types of violence. I've just made an ATLAS family. and then I can filter by it so that now these are the only ones that are operating in the HU. And then I can produce a frequency table. And now, because I've put that filter on, these are the only ones showing. So I'm going to make these 45 supercodes the columns of a table, and the 44 documents for each person as the rows of the table. And now I can produce an Excel spreadsheet which is showing me the distribution. I'll just turn all the zeros off so it's easy to say. I said I wasn't going to do this. I was just going to show you, but I couldn't resist just doing it quickly. I'll just take off the zeros. I can quickly find them. So now we can see which people have cases of valence of which kind. So level 3 perpetrated by some distant person that's happening right now. That's that supercode right there that I'm highlighting. So that particular type of valence, person number 1 had 1, and gosh, who else has 1? That person is the only one that had an example of that kind of valence. This kind is much more common. This person had 2, this person had 1. And the result of this is that one can then produce all kinds of analyses, which I do not have time to show you now, which take that spreadsheet and further analyze it and correlate it with their food insecurity status in order to produce an article. And on the other side, we extract all the actual text for each of those 44 types of valence and do an interpretive analysis of what each of those types means, and then accumulate them in a different way to write up a qualitative article. So without going any further over my time, I've done very briefly summarized this phase 4, which was identifying the new unit of analysis, the case, figuring out a way to represent that in ATLAS, which is by a renamed central quotation, and then going ahead. And then the quantitative article was published in Public Health Nutrition. You'll see this at the end of the slides, and the qualitative manuscript is waiting to be published, and you can email me if you want a copy of it. So that will end my presentation, and I'll look forward to see if there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wolf, for your great presentation. Now we will have some time for questions. So let me see if I see somebody who would like to ask. If you have a question, you have just to click on the hand icon on the control panel, and I will give the microphone to you. So, any questions, ideas, comments? Let me see. Let's wait for a moment. It seems that we have no questions written, neither I can't see any hand raised. So maybe I can ask some questions for you. And meanwhile, our participants think about their questions. So I would like to know a little bit more about how did you use memos for your study? Because I usually use a lot of memos, but you didn't mention anything about memos. So I would like to talk about or to know your opinion on that. But before you answer, I see that Mabel, she raised her hand, so I will just open her microphone, and later on, when you have a little bit of time, you will answer my question. So Mabel, the microphone is yours. Mabel? Hello? Mabel? Can you hear us? Hello. Yes, it seems that she has her question written. Okay, and her question is about how many papers can you publish from this work alone? and she's very excited with your presentation, as me. And can you show an example report for the analysis process you explained just now? So, Nick, I will open your microphone to answer all these questions. The microphone is yours.
Yes. The first part, how many articles can one produce on this? Well, many. And the lesson I've learned in all these studies is that the number of manuscripts one can write and possibly publish on a body of data of this size is not limited by the research process, but is limited by the research funding. So if we had lots of money to pay myself and other people to continue working on this, there are many, many things we would like to do on this. First of all, we did this one central quantitative article, which is this one: very low food security is linked with exposure to violence. And this just focused on the most food insecure women in the sample subset, and showed that they, I'm not sure I'm showing you anything valuable here, no I'm not, and showed how their experience correlated with the most extreme violence in order to inform the public health literature. One could also do other quantitative analyses based on these distributions for to inform something in the violence literature, violence against women literature, but we don't have an opportunity to fund or do that. On the qualitative side, my manuscript is an overview of a proposed conceptual framework based on this three-dimensional scheme of the way that people in this population, this sort of at-risk population, it's not a totally good word for it, but certain population could possibly be conceptualized, because we were not generating our framework of violence based on the literature of violence, but fully grounded from what came up from the data. There could be numerous possible other qualitative reports focused on certain things. We could certainly write a short article just on fear. But this is one of the 9 topics, and it happened that the principal investigator was overwhelmed by the experiences of violence that these women experienced. And her center at Drexel University, and the focus of her advocacy, is all about nutrition and hunger and has nothing whatsoever to do with violence. But she was so overwhelmed by their lives in this area that she wanted the whole initial focus that we had funding for to focus on that. However, we could analyze in a similar kind of way the 9/10 of the data that is not about violence, which is about housing and their physical environment and their welfare state and so on. As I'm, let's see if it's right here. No, it's not. Give me 1 second, because I will also answer. Yeah, is it? Yes. So just before I continue answering your question about the kinds of article, let me just mention something about memos, and then I'll come right back and answer that. So Nuringa and many, many people find great value in using Atlas's memo system. I choose not to use the memo system, or very rarely. So here are the Atlas memos, and I do have some memos, but they are for reference material. Like here is a couple of paragraphs about life worlds. Here are some ideas that came up about living in poverty. They're not really analytic memos. They are summaries of literature, formal or informal. Here are names and abbreviations of each of the participant. Here's some notes I made on the visual analysis textbooks, because we were going to analyze all the 8,000 photographs we have of them. So I use memos for reference materials. I choose to use the comment system for all my analytical writing. I write either on quotation comments or code comments, because I find it much more helpful to have my analytic writing in context. And if I could just make one sort of summary point about that, where somebody else would use a memo for a more broad, high-level analytical topic and write a memo on it, I make a high-level code, what I call a high-level code, and write that text, analytical writing, on the comment of that high-level code, and I link code and a memo are an object in Atlas that has a name and an area where you can do writing.
Excuse me, Nick.
And you
can you hear me?
Yes.
Could you repeat the last few sentences,
yes.
Because I couldn't hear your voice. Something happened.
Oh, okay.
Okay, just few sentences before you follow.
So I was I'm not sure how many sentences, but anyway, I was saying why I prefer comments over memos. One reason is because they're in context and I pop them up all over the place and they print out when I want them, and they are very related to either a code or a quotation or a document. For example, all the case write-ups or the those case descriptions I did initially on each person, those word outlines, I pasted those in as document comments. I didn't want them as memos. I could have made a memo for each person and pasted in my word outline of them in there, but I would much rather have them as a PD comment so that whenever I'm looking at a person, I can just pop up their comment. Here's the PD comment. As I go from person to person, then the comment changes. There's their comment. That's a PD comment. So I use PD comments, quotation comments, and code comments to capture my writing. But the specific thing I wanted to mention was that for broad brush, big theme kind of writing, which perhaps is the most typical way you would use a memo, you're coding away at a very detailed level, and then you want to write broadly about something, you create a memo to do that. Now, rather than do that, I create a code, and I think of it as a high-level code. I don't attach that code to data, but I attach other codes to it and portray them in networks, and all my analytical writing is on the comments of those high-level codes. And the underlying rationale for that is that I view memos and comments as similar kinds of software objects. Philosophically, a memo I consider to be like an inferior code. Both codes and memos have characteristics in common. They are objects in a list. They have names. They have areas where you can write the text. In one case, a code comment, in one case, the memo text. And you can link them to other things. But codes, you can link more powerfully to other things, and you can use them to accumulate quotations through supercodes in the query tool, whereas memos, it's much more inferior. So I prefer to have the one list of codes, and the things that other people would use as memos, I have a set of codes which have a symbol in front of them, maybe the $sign, which segregates them off as a separate set, and they've got various analytic writings in them, but they're also linked in networks to their component parts. So it's just a choice. Other people prefer to have their memos sort of separate from their coding scheme. That's fine. I prefer to have it all integrated as to have one set of concepts that is representing the progress of the study. Some of those concepts are high-level themes. Some of them are very detailed codes that are attached to data. Some are tagging codes that are doing something in particular. Some are sort of housekeeping codes, like great quotes, quotations that are particularly valuable that I might want to use in extract later. I add that code to the coding, like this one here. So this is coded to something, but it's also coded to great quotes. So later in this query tool, I can extract all the quotations coded to say violence and also coded to great quotes. So now one of the comments is the HU's comment. and there's a little button for it up here. And I like to keep track of all my just thoughts. Now, you could write a memo on that. Have a memo of your current thoughts. That'd be perfectly fine. But it's off on the right-hand side, and you have to open the memo manager. I like to just click on the buttons and pop up these comments. So now getting back to the questioner, as I was going, I kept track of all these different ideas of what was happening, and this contains examples of numerous other kinds of analyses that could be done. One that we're interested in is breaking the cycle of poverty. And much of what they said in these 9 topics, we could do a cross-topic analysis to show that it's a very, very big subject, that basically people in this position need help in breaking the cycle of poverty, and we can sort of make a good case for saying that it's unreasonable with the forces that are portrayed against them, including violence and other things, for them to do it themselves, even though they try desperately to do that. And then resilience. And so breaking the cycle is another one. Attitudes to welfare is definitely another one. Everything to do with their children could go in the child literature, because there was this remarkable phenomenon as anything to do with their children, their whole values and behavior and everything changed. So the children are the levers of change for them, and so on and so on. So yes, I would say if there was unlimited funding, I bet we could do 10 different manuscripts on this if we had 5 years and we were able to spend the time doing it. But we focused on what was the principal investigator felt was most important. Okay.
Thank you, Nick. Let's ask, I see that Annie Munera, she's with us today. So Annie, I will open your microphone because I see that you have some ideas, suggestions. So I will just open your microphone to say hello and ask directly your question. Annie, the microphone is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Naringa. And it was a very brilliant presentation, Dr. Nick Wolf. I enjoyed every minute of the session today. I foresee myself will be citing the 5 steps that you have shared today. I am just wondering if you can share with us any papers or reports explaining about the steps that you have shared with us today. If you do have those reports or articles, I would really like to have the link or the paper itself so that I can cite them in my future papers. Thank you again.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Nick, I will open your microphone. The microphone is yours.
Yes, I'm not sure if you meant about the 5-level QDA process or about the methods adopted in this study. Could you just sort of type your answer to Naringa or something?
Annie, the microphone is yours.
Yeah, it's about the 5.
Oh, you're still on. Great.
Yeah, it's about the 5 process.
Yes. Okay. Well, that is what my textbook's about. Now, let's see. There is when I gave the keynote address in Berlin last year, where I introduced 5-level QDA. And there's a paper in the conference proceedings for that. I haven't received the link for that myself yet. I don't know if Naringa has it, but I know it's being published along with the other papers for that conference. Well, that's coming up. So maybe Suzanne Fries, who I'm sure you're aware of, is the editor. I don't know if she's the editor, but anyway, she's organizing all that and is going to be distributing the links to that. So you can certainly download that paper. That paper focuses on the origin and derivation of this, because over the years my general insight has been that most people go wrong by doing this, learning to use Atlas in reverse. They learn how the software features work, and then they try and look for ways of using those features in their data analysis, which typically isn't going to work very well and leads people to not use Atlas for the entirety of the project, or makes them do their analysis in a much more cut and dried way than is appropriate. So I've always tried to teach people to do the reverse, to start with the research question, make a conceptual plan. Let me just pop up this extremely brief schematic of it. create a conceptual plan, and then identify individual analytic tasks. The key point is this translation between the units of the task and what's called the affordances of the software tools. And you don't muddy the strategies and the tactics. You're very clear that the software is working in a very cut and dried way, but once you've done this translation process, you have an actual task to do, and then the results of that you then retranslate in terms of the units of the task. So I had this kind of, this is how I tried to help people, but when I wanted to start writing about it, I discovered I did a lot of research on strategies and tactics and couldn't find much help until I discovered a book of military strategy which lays out these 5 levels of universal activity in all areas of strategy. And this really is derived from this model of military strategy, but it's completely adapted for our field. So that paper on the conference proceedings really focuses on the 5 levels of military strategy and how that relates to the 5 levels of QDA. I'm now fleshing it all out in this full-scale textbook, and I'm afraid I don't have anything for you until this is finished. It's supposed to be, and I'm really hoping it will be finished this year. And on the back page of this, you'll see I already have the cover done to motivate me to keep writing and getting this thing finished. There's a little summary of what's in the book on the right side, and at the bottom there, and I can just tell you because it's so easy to remember, the title of the book is How to Use ATLAS.ti Powerfully, and if you care to, you can send an email to howtoUseATLAS.ti Powerfully@gmail.com, and I'll put you on a list of people to keep updated about this. And there may well be a paper published, but it actually wouldn't be published until next year, actually, on 5-level QDA. I've got a proposal in to write a regular paper on it. So you can either write to me individually or to that address, and I've got a growing list of people who want to be kept in touch with this, and I can let you know that way.
Thank you very much, Nick, for all your answers. We appreciate a lot. Before we finalize the session, I just would like to invite you all. I just would like to invite you all of you using ATLAS.ti to visit our website, especially free training section. If anybody wants to learn ATLAS.ti, we use every week free webinars, so you can go on the website and learn more about that. I will send you also an evaluation form after this presentation. I will attach a PowerPoint presentation of Dr. Wolf and also a link if you want to watch once again of this presentation. So, Dr. Wolf, would you like to say goodbye before we end the session?
Yes, thank you very much, Nunga, for inviting me, and I enjoyed putting this together, and I loved hearing the questions, which were very helpful. And thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that all of us, we have enjoyed very much your presentation. And thank you all of you for participating in this webinar. It's very important, your participation, to make this series successful. So I look forward to seeing all of you in our future events or this webinar series. So thank you very much, Dr. Wolf. Thank you all of you participating in this session, and goodbye.